welcome everyone. My name is Diana Whitlock. On behalf of the Greencastle League of Women Voters, Banner Graphic, and WGRE, I want to welcome everyone to the first of two of our Zoom candidate forums this election season. We will have the audience remain muted throughout the forum. So if you have questions at any time, you could put those in chat. I would ask you to wait a few minutes if you could so that we can try to take down some negative comments that we've had, and then we will certainly open the chat back up for everyone. Tonight's forum will feature candidates running for State Senate District 24, John Crane and Dan Albaugh. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our panelists this evening are Rhoda Alexander, Jared Jernigan, and Sophie Hensley. Our moderator for the evening will be Kelly Keefe. For the first
it's actually
part of the
switched.
forum,
I'm a panelist, and then Sophie Hensley's the moderator.
I'll be moderating.
Sorry. Okay, so we have
Yeah. No, you're fine. I just wanted to clarify that.
That is no problem. Sorry. Thank you for catching that. I appreciate that. So the first part of the forum, we will have our panelists ask questions to the candidates. We will keep audience members on mute at this time. And then the second part will be the questions from the audience. And again, in a few minutes, we'll have you put your questions in the chat. But please do make sure that your questions are written in such a way that they can be answered by both candidates. The next section after that of the forum, we'll have breakout rooms available. And if the candidates would be willing, we will allow people to meet with small groups with the candidates and the attendees of their choice. I'm now going to turn the evening over to our moderator, who is Sophie.
Hi, everybody.
Sorry, just a moment, Sophie. I apologize. I think with some tech help, we've got those comments cleared off and that individual out of the conference. So from this point forward, if you, as an audience member, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will continue to monitor those. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Hensley. I'm from WGRE. Welcome to this debate. The length of part one will be 30 minutes. Each candidate will make an opening statement of not more than 2 minutes. The candidates will respond to a series of questions in this pattern. The first panelist will be Jared Jernigan. The second panelist will be Kelly Keefe. And the third panelist will be Rhonda Alexander. This will be the rotation pattern. The panelists will pose a question for up to 30 seconds, and the candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. Once both candidates have answered the question, each candidate can rebuttal for up to 1 minute. So, John, you will have your opening statement due to the coin toss, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to get on with all of you, and special thanks to the Greencastle League of Women Voters and to WGRE and to the Banner Graphic for hosting this event every election cycle. I think it's really important to be able to provide a forum like this so that the good folks of our community can hear from elected officials and those who are running for office. And so I really appreciate that. When I first ran for this position, I was an unknown commodity to many people. And as I told people then, I didn't run for this office for political ambition or for any of the perks and any of that. And I can tell you, after having been in this position for 4 years, that the perks are minimal. And the intent for me was to really try to serve the people as best I could and to bring my style of leadership to the State House and be a part of trying to continue to make a difference in Indiana. I think that especially relative to where Indiana's positioned nationally, I think that we are either a leader or on our way to being a leader in many different areas, and I'm grateful for that. And I appreciate especially the opportunity for the election cycle that we're blessed to have in this great country, where we have the opportunity as Americans and as citizens to be able to have our voice heard at the ballot box, to weigh the merits and positions of competing candidates, and to pick those that we think will best represent us. And so I'll simply say that it's been a great privilege for me to be able to serve in this role. And I think that there is more work to be done. And so that's why I've continued to run for re-election and hope for your support. I look forward to a great conversation tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Stan, would you like to begin your opening statement?
Yes, thank you. I would like to start by thanking the League of Women's Voters for sponsoring this debate and everybody associated with it. My name is Stan Allball. I'm a retired Air Force colonel with over 30 years of active duty service, and I'm the Democratic candidate for the Indiana State Senate in District 24. The central plank of my platform centers around education, and I would like to briefly tell you why it's so important to me. I grew up poor, and when I say poor, I mean the neighbors buying us groceries poor. My father had a lung taken out when I was in the 5th grade and died my senior year of high school. In order to escape poverty, I joined the military. I found myself guarding nuclear-loaded B-52s in Glasgow, Montana, and the temperature had fallen to 72 degrees below zero wind chill factor. Well, at 65 below, they took the dogs in and left me outside. So when you realize where you are on the food chain and it's below the canine, that can be very motivating. Fortunately for me, my parents had always emphasized the importance of education. Even though I didn't listen as a child, I knew that I either was going to have to accept that as my life or I was going to have to educate myself out of it. So I went to night school and graduated from a state university. Then I went back into the Air Force and I flew B-52s, B-1s, and E-3s. I commanded the largest program flying training operations in the Air Force. I was a division chief at the Pentagon during 9/11. I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I spent 2.5 years on the ground in Baghdad. I had a very successful career and was fortunate enough to retire at the rank of full colonel. And that was all due to public education. Public education is how the middle class, the working poor, and
Please
the
wrap up. You
poor.
have your 2 minutes is up.
All right, we will now begin with the questions from Jared. You may ask your first question to Stan Allball.
Okay, yes, Stan. So it's funny that you actually mentioned education because that is the first thing I have on my mind tonight. What do you propose the state do with funding for virtual students once we get past January 1st? Because obviously there's been an emergency measure to keep them fully funded through this semester, but what should the General Assembly do about that moving forward?
Well, thank you for the question. I certainly believe that the legislature should continue to fund it in that way. I believe that the schools on their opening and operation should absolutely occur based on the numbers and the rates in those areas or those schools. I absolutely want local control. I want local health officials making a determination on is it safe. I want school boards and superintendents to be making those decisions based upon what's in the best interest and the most safety for those children. The idea of the legislature using pressure or applying that pressure to those school boards by threatening to reduce the funding to 85% is just wrong. We actually need to increase the funding because the additional cleaning supplies, the additional food servicing, all those are being done on paper and plastic, all being discarded. Things are actually costing more to do this. I want education to continue to operate. I know there's going to be a lot of innovation as we move forward, but it should not be the state legislature forcing that decision.
Great. Jared, you can repeat the question for Senator John Crane.
Okay, yes, Senator Crane, what do you propose the state do with funding for virtual students beyond January 1st? Because as you know, emergency measures were taken to fully fund those students for this semester.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Let me clear up a misconception, and I just heard it stated that we have decided to reduce funding to 85%. The reality that our Senate Pro Tem, Rod Bray, who also represents the other part of Putnam County, pointed out is that that is actually already in statute. It wasn't that we were taking it away, it's that people went to the microphone in the media and said, we're going to fully fund 100% when statute actually didn't allow for that given the previous position on virtual education. Of course, with COVID, it created an environment that nobody could have anticipated. And we went from an e-learning model that was used primarily to compensate for snow days and was intended to be for a handful of days to an e-learning model that required a greater longevity. And so it caused not only schools to have to pivot, but also for a reevaluation of exactly the question that you're posing, Jared, which is how do we continue to fund those classrooms? I will tell you that that is a massive conversation that's going on the Senate Education Committee where I serve, and also throughout the larger Senate and the legislature, because the bottom line is we want to make sure that every child does have a high quality education. I think we're all beneficiaries of that, and we want to make that possible. I've called the coronavirus the great revealer, and one of the things that it has revealed is that if we do not shore up the
30
technology
seconds.
accessibility, then we are going to have students, and we already have some students who are falling through the cracks. And so we want to do everything possible to make sure that we shore that up and continue high quality education going forward.
Great. Stan, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Yes, I agree, and I understand what the legislation, what the current law says. The problem that I think most Hoosiers had with it was the things that were blown up in the media, and as the letter from the Senate Pro Tem as it was released and spread to the media. One of the things that could have helped alleviate a lot of that across Indiana would have been if the legislation would have called upon the governor to try and get a special session. In my mind, we need to change the
30
law.
seconds.
We need to change the law for the federal safety that allows the governor to declare the emergency, and it should automatically bring the legislature back into session within 30 days, and so that these issues can be addressed and handled by our legislation.
John, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Thank you. That's exactly right about the issue that it got blown up in the media. I think it's more about a communication issue than it is about the actual funding itself. And it was important to make sure that people realized that they weren't going to get the full 100% at that point, so that you can adjust expectations, because teachers on the ground and administrators who are making those decisions have to have that information. We may get into the executive orders and special session in the further part of this conversation.
30
but
seconds.
I would say that there are conversations going on to shore up new and better ways to rebalance the power so that the legislature has the stronger voice that is needed. And so I look forward to having that part of the conversation as well.
Kelly from WGRE, you may ask your question to Senator Crane.
So I'll be asking a question based off of education as well. And my question is, who should decide where children should go to school, the parents or government officials? And would you reject any effort to restrict parental choice in education?
I am a strong advocate of parental choice because as educators and others have told me in trying to advocate for other pieces of legislation, and I quote, "Parents are the first and best teachers." And I believe that's the case. Now that assumes obviously that you've got invested parents in the home, but assuming that's the case, then parents are better suited to know exactly what the best environment is. I know of situations where families have children who are in a public school, they have other children who are in a private school, and they have a child or two who might be homeschooled because they recognize the differences between those children. And so I think it's important to make sure that we maintain their freedom of choice within the existing system that we have, and recognize that if they're allowed to make those choices, then they are inclined to make the best choice for themselves and for their children. And I will do everything I can to make sure that we protect that option for them.
Kelly, please repeat your question to Stan Albo.
Who should decide where children should go to school, the parents or government officials? And would you reject any effort to restrict parental choice in education?
Clearly, parents should decide where their children should go to school. But the follow-up to that is who should pay for it. I do take issue with the idea that we are taking our tax dollars and sending our tax dollars to charter and private schools. And then those charter and private schools are not held to the same code or the same standard as public schools. For example, here recently in the news, I mean, one of the virtual charter schools, stole $68 million, and we've done nothing in which to get it back. I also know individuals that have chosen to homeschool their children because, yes, they're probably the best one to make that choice, but the individual themselves did not graduate high school. So some of that, I think, needs to be tempered. Any place that public money follows, I think accountability needs to follow with it. I think certified teachers are necessary. I think if you're going to have a charter school, the school should not be able to hire for-profit contractors, because there's lots of cases around the state where what is happening, where in theory it's a public charter school, but the school is simply using it as a cash register filter to take public money and filter it off for-profit contractors, because they open up a business where they provide all the services to the school and then bill straight through. The same thing with with private schools. If you want your child to have a private school education, I'm all for that as your choice. However, if you want my tax dollars to pay for it, I think tax dollars are intended for what's in the public good. Private schools have existed throughout time. If you believe the director of public education, she says that what we have is 29% of the people that attend those private schools have never attended a public school, and it basically boils down to white flight, trying to avoid integration as they flee to those schools.
Thank you. John, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Thank you. I've heard this argument, we shouldn't be using public money for private education, and I would take exception to that because I don't believe it's actually public money. It's private money that started in the pockets and the wallets of private taxpayers that's been used for public purposes. Our job as legislators is to be guardians of the public trust, and the challenge, as I've found and has existed for some time, is how do you manage a system of 292 school districts across the state?
30 seconds.
There is a universal guidelines and so forth, while also providing a system that creates flexibility. We can all agree that there are great public schools, great private schools, and great homeschool situations. We can also agree that there are bad apples in public schools, private schools, and homeschool situations, and our job is to provide that high quality education while still maintaining the guardian of that public trust.
Stan, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Okay, I would start with the idea that obviously tax dollars are in fact public money. They are not private money, or else the same argument would have to extend through to people in my age category that do not have children in school. Then I would argue that my money should not then be going to the school. Of course it's tax, it's public money, and once it's been collected and I paid it to the state. We need to maintain and do the best that we can to support those public schools. The amount of money that we've taken away, last year was almost $200 million taken away from public education in order to fund the largest voucher program in the country. I applaud John because he can afford to give his children a private education, but I don't think that you should take any of my tax dollars to pay for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Rhoda, you may ask your first question to Stan Albo. Stan, as a reminder, you have 2 minutes to answer.
Hi, Stan. Due to the pandemic, state budgets across the country are facing budget shortfalls. How would you go about balancing the budget? What would you cut and what would you protect?
Thank you for that question. Very difficult question, especially for somebody that's not in office and doesn't have as much understanding. Things that absolutely need protection, in my mind, public education is first and foremost. And the reason for that is because we had already fallen to 51st in the country in regards to keeping up with inflation. When in Danville, they hire teachers at $36,000 a year, and in the last 4 years, they've gotten 1.5% pay raises. And then the same thing in when you move out to North Putnam, where they're hiring them at $33,000 a year. We are so far behind that 94% of those 290 school corporations, 94% of them have open positions that they cannot fill. And so it is a race to the bottom if we're not funding our public education. Education should not be viewed as an expense, but as an investment in the next generation and its impact on jobs in the future in Indiana. Because as the economy evolves to a knowledge-based economy, that education is going to be becoming a lot more important, so we can attract higher paying jobs as opposed to just warehouse jobs. And I'm not talking down about that. I'm just saying I want jobs that pay more money to help lift our economy.
Rhoda, will you please repeat your question for John?
John, the question is, due to the pandemic, state budgets across the country are facing budget shortfalls. How would you balance the budget? What would you cut? And what would you protect?
Thank you, Rhoda. I appreciate that. You're exactly right. And we all recognize this, that the COVID pandemic has created some real challenges. I agree with my opponent that education is a massive priority. I take exception when people challenge me and say we need to make education a priority, because the reality is we have a $34 billion budget. It's a 2-year budget, and almost 51% of that budget goes to K-12 education. Another 13% goes to higher ed, which means that education is the #1 priority in the state of Indiana. Now, I agree that we need to try to help pay teachers more and do those kinds of things, but the idea that we aren't taking education seriously doesn't match up with the dollars that we're putting towards it. Another area that I think needs continued support is shoring up the foster care system and DCS. We have literally thousands of children, about 36,000 children who are in the foster care DCS system. That is an absolute tragedy, and I applaud those folks that are working both in DCS and those who are downstream in homes trying to be foster care parents for kids in need of parents. In terms of what I would change, I would probably work to try to continue to streamline our operations, both at the state level and certainly at the federal level. There's an excess
30 seconds.
Things that if we could take a good hard look at that and perhaps streamline some of our processes and things like that, we could be even more efficient. But I will tell you this, in a recent U.S. News and World Report survey and study, Indiana is ranked #2 in the nation for long-term
10 seconds.
stability, and I'm very proud of that.
Stan, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Thank you. I would take exception to a couple of things that he said. I don't believe that we are, in fact, at the top. I think we're ranked something like 37th in our education. Some of the things that we're doing indicates that maybe we're not doing as good a job. I also take a little bit of exception to the numbers that he had based on education. We passed, in 2008, we passed a property tax cap referendum that put a cap on property tax cap, and at the same time, that removed $1.8 billion from funding, and we changed the way we completely fund education, and I think it needs to be completely reworked. There are only 6 states that do it the same way that we do. That removal of that $1.8 billion plus the tax cuts that occurred by Governor Daniels caused a significant reduction, over $1.9 billion removal from public education. And then we have not kept up with inflation for the preceding 10 years. And so I would say that we've not done a good job in prioritizing or staying up with the costs necessary to help protect the education of our children so they can achieve their American dream.
Thank you. John, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Yeah, let me clarify. I didn't say we were up at the top with education. I said that we were ranked #2 in long-term fiscal stability as a state regarding our entire budget, and that's important. I've had a number of people over the years talk about how we can increase funding to education or other areas and say, hey, we need to dip into our rainy day fund. And it's great, and it's a viable solution. It seems very attractive when things are good, but a rainy day fund is in place specifically for the unprecedented, like a pandemic, and now we're recognizing why fiscal stability is so important. the other thing, just to stay again, and
30 seconds.
argument about whether more money should be spent, but go look up the budget, and the reality is that almost 51% of a $34 billion budget is dedicated specifically to K-12 education, and another 13% is to higher ed. So education is
10
the
seconds.
number one priority in the state of Indiana.
Thank you. Jared, you may ask your second question to John Crane.
Okay, yes, Senator. So I spend at least about 5 hours a month sitting in on county meetings, and so I am wondering, with obviously we know that some things are going to be changing in budgets in the coming years with a shortfall of income tax revenue. So what can we do to ensure, or what can be done at the state level to ensure that, you know, the flow of money is still getting there to the counties so that the counties and municipalities are still able to do their jobs?
Yeah, great question. One of the things that I think is really important and has been under normal circumstances is a good working relationship between the state leadership and the municipalities across our state of Indiana. That has never been more urgent than now as we continue to navigate through COVID and hopefully whatever the aftermath will look like if we can get through it. It's important, and it's a conversation that we're continuing to have to make sure that we are getting clear communication from the bottom up on what those needs are and how we can continue to funnel that money as needed. Obviously, we have a constitutional amendment now that was put into the Constitution, so we are constitutionally required to maintain a balanced budget, which I think is really important, and that means that there's certain constraints on what we can do. But the goal through all of that is to continue to bring all parties to the table. And so I would say, generally speaking, there may be some exceptions, but generally speaking, that working relationship has been very open and very collaborative, and I look forward to it continuing to be so.
Jared, please repeat your question for Stan.
Yes. So yes, Stan. You know, what I was asking is, what can be done at the state level to ensure the ongoing, you know, proper flow of money to counties and municipalities, given the constraints that we know are coming, you know, in the years to come because of COVID shortfalls.
Well, on this particular issue, I am going to have to agree with John. The necessity to maintain an open communications with the county and be able to attack the problems on a whole array of areas is essential. One section that I don't quite agree with is that balanced budget amendment that we passed now as part of the Constitution. If I'm not mistaken, it only pertains to revenue, and so it still requires, I believe, a much higher vote or necessary to be able to dip into the through the rainy day fund to the $2 billion cash on hand. But clearly, that rainy day fund, the pandemic clearly qualifies as the rainy day. If we're not going to use it now, I can't imagine what we're using it for. So that support and stuff should be necessary to help those cities and municipalities to be able to operate and provide the necessary services, especially when it comes to in the area of you know, education, law enforcement, and fire, and more particularly probably the law enforcement and fire, as those budgets are handled normally at the lower level. So I do agree with that. Thank you.
John, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Yeah, thank you. I think to Stan's point, it's a bipartisan issue. I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think one of the things that critical pandemics and other crises create, hopefully, is a spirit of unity and collaboration. And stewarding the financial resources is really important. I am grateful that we have fantastic and really brilliant leadership in the legislature who handles the budget, both in the House.
30 seconds.
And they are very vigilant about making sure that those things that are absolute essential priorities continue to be maintained, and then continuing to negotiate within the caps of a balanced budget. and they do a fantastic job.
10 seconds.
Can't have everything, but we're trying to stay focused on the most important things, and we'll continue to do that.
Stan, you have 1 minute to rebuttal.
Well, once again, I do agree that this is a bipartisan issue. I certainly hope that the rainy day fund will be used and can be used in the rebuilding post-COVID on those things and stuff that are necessary. Like I said, I believe my understanding is the other limits based on the constitutional amendment are limited to revenue, and then that becomes problematic if we do that balanced budget amendment and cap it to the revenue versus using the rainy day fund. I would implore the legislature to dip into that rainy day fund and to do the things necessary to help rebuild Indiana post-COVID.
Great, thank you. This is the end of part one. Each candidate will have up to 60 seconds for closing remarks. The order of that will be the same for opening remarks. Therefore, John, you have 1 minute for your closing remark.
Thank you, and I appreciate the questions from our panel. One of my great regrets in all of these is that we never have enough time to hear all the questions that are out there, and so I appreciate the questions that were offered. I appreciate the dialogue both with Stan and with you all, and I do think, especially against the backdrop of COVID, this is an opportunity for us to come together as Hoosiers and continue to do what we can. Obviously, there's a lot of really good people in the State House, and that was one of the most surprising and pleasant things that I discovered in coming to the State House is there genuinely are a lot of really good people.
30 seconds.
We might see things a little differently through our particular worldview lens, but people are down there trying to do the right thing amidst extraordinary challenges. And so where we get into passionate debate is good for dialogue and continuing to try to find those solutions. And we're going to continue to do that. So I appreciate the chance that we've had to be able to get this conversation started, and I look forward to more of it in the future.
Great, thank you. Stan, you have 1 minute for your closing remark.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate everything that we're discussing here today. I appreciate the questions and stuff as they've come in. I certainly have been learning as I have been campaigning and listening as much as I can, both to legislators, other elected officials, local business leaders, county officials, and trying to understand or learn as much as I can on what we need to do in the best way to move forward.
30 seconds.
I hope that we can continue to do that both across the board. I hope that we can make the changes necessary and respond well coming out of COVID in this next legislative session, and that we will do better going forward as a state. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I will now turn this panel over to the Greencastle League of Women's Voters.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, candidates. We have several questions in the chat from our audience participants. And we'll start with Stan, since John went first on the closing remarks, and both candidates will have an opportunity to answer. But let's start with Stan. What is your position on secure gun storage laws?
I am a strong proponent of secure gun storage. I can tell you that the amount of children that are involved in gun-related incidences because parents don't accurately secure them is in fact a problem. I can tell you, much to my just being upset about, I have an ex-son-in-law. He keeps loaded guns, even when my grandchildren, when they were only 12 and 13, were in the house with smaller children, and they would be left there all day babysitting with a loaded AR-15 on the refrigerator, loaded Glocks in the nightstands. I'm very pro law enforcement, very pro guns. I own guns. I have a concealed carry permit. I want to make sure that parents and responsible gun owners are doing everything that they can to help keep the guns out of their children's hands and out of the hands of people that should not or are not licensed or allowed to have them.
Thank you. Senator Crane, your position on secure gun storage laws?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not opposed to secure gun storage laws. The premise of gun ownership is responsible gun ownership. And under our Constitution, we have a Second Amendment protection, which allows us the freedom to be able to keep and bear arms for protecting our families, our home, and our property. And I think against the backdrop of all the protests and the fact that many of our cities are burning figuratively and literally, there is a great fear of what's going on, combined with the undermining of the good men and women in law enforcement. There's a lot of people who have started to think twice about what are my options, and which is why the purchase of firearms is setting records across the country. Well, with that comes the corresponding responsibility to keep those firearms in a safe place. And as has been pointed out, we all have heard those tragic stories of children who have gotten access to a firearm that they shouldn't have gotten access to and end up creating tragedy. And so I think we need to do everything possible to find that balance between proper securing of our weapons, but also maintaining the freedoms that are protected in our Constitution.
Thank you. Next audience question, Senator Crane. Earlier this month, the president signed an executive order forbidding agencies with federal contracts from having diversity training programs for their employees. Do you agree with this executive order? And do you believe that Indiana should follow suit and also forbid agencies that they contract with from doing diversity training for their employees?
I think it's the president's decision to do what he wants to do. I'm not the president, so that wasn't my call. But I think continuing to understand different people and different cultures, different races and different experiences is what is important. I mean, we're all Americans. We are the melting pot, and there is a beautiful kaleidoscope of diversity in our country. And if I continue to just surround myself with people that look the way I do and think the way I do, then I will have hit some kind of ceiling in my own understanding and my own recognition of certain truths about the world and certain experiences that I think could be beneficial to me. And so I think it's really, really important for us to continue to pursue understanding the people around us, especially in today's divisive climate. One of the things that's one of my greatest frustrations is that it feels like we've gotten to a point beyond civility where we can't just have differences of opinion, that if we state a difference of opinion, all of a sudden it means that we hate the other person. And that shouldn't be. And I think one of the best ways to try to minimize that is to get to know your neighbor. It's very simple. But we also live in an isolated, increasingly isolated communities where we don't spend as much time with each other in conversation and interacting and things like that. And so I think we've got a ways to go, but I think there's some good steps that are being taken to try to help us all understand each other a little bit better.
Thank you. Mr. Albaugh, your comments. Do you agree with this executive order, and do you believe that Indiana should follow suit and also forbid agencies that they contract with from doing diversity training for their employees?
To start with, I've got to go back to my military experience and that I spent 30 years in the military. So I'm very accustomed to receiving that kind of training, very much aware of it. I believe that it works very well. I think it is important on things that we can learn from each other. I think we as a society improve, and we're much stronger for the strengths of our diversity. I do not think that that Indiana should move away from it or should comply or follow suit with that. I think that we need to embrace that diversity as much as possible. I do agree that more interaction or more activity associated with different people of different cultures and different races makes us better, smarter, and it is a positive thing for us as our society. I would also say that that's also part of my endorsement on the public school system. In regards to the diversity training, I absolutely disagree. Yes, I understand it's the president's call, but I certainly hope that that will be reversed come November. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And also, starting with you, Mr. Alba, so we'll go to you again as well. On the issue of school funding, audience question is, can you comment on how private schools who receive funding are permitted to discriminate against students and staff based on gender and sexuality? Should tax dollars be used to fund private organizations that are permitted to discriminate on the basis of religious beliefs? Where's the line here between public and private?
Well, see, thank you for that question. That's exactly part of my problem that I have with public funding going to charter and private schools. In this case, this question specifically private schools. Because if they're going to take anybody that takes public money, that money needs to be for the public good and should not be used to discriminate against somebody else or paying to discriminate against themselves. So I absolutely agree that they should not be allowed, or they should not be receiving public money. Any place that receives public money should meet the same standards and expectations with Title I, II, and Title IX. I mean, across the board on those standards. The idea, we have cases across the country where people are being fired based on their sexual orientation or any number of things. They discriminate against students that they permit into those private schools. They discriminate against the teachers that they have in those schools. They discriminate across the board, and for tax dollars to go to that. So then what you have is a family that is being forced basically to fund discrimination against themselves if their child happens to go or is on a voucher system. I very, very much disagree with that and would oppose that in the legislature.
Thank you. Senator Crane, your comments. Should tax dollars be used to fund private organizations that are permitted to discriminate on the basis of religious beliefs? And where is this line between public and private?
Yeah, I think you've got two issues there. One is the conversation we had earlier about the difference between public and private dollars. And my opponent and I will just have to agree to disagree. If I was giving my money to the government, that's one thing. But the government is taking the money, which means if I don't pay my taxes, I go to jail. That's why I say it's my money and it's being taken. Now, they put it towards a variety of different things. I happen to be a conservative. I think that liberals would be up in arms if, for example, all the money was going towards private schools because of differences in belief. So on the one hand, you have the financial funding piece. On the other hand, you have a fundamental, foundational issue, and that is the protection of religious liberty in this state and nation. Our federal Constitution talks about the specific protection of the right to practice your religious beliefs or your rights of conscience. And our state constitution has even stronger language about that. And so I think that it's imperative that private schools who may have a religious belief that says that marriage is between a man and a woman or hold to a biblical code of morality should have the ability to be able to create that school and create that environment that adheres to those beliefs. And so I think if we take that right away, we are not only undermining a foundational principle, but really it impacts all of us. Because if we as American citizens and as Hoosiers don't have that fundamental right to practice our rights of conscience, then we are moving one step closer to government groupthink versus the individual freedoms that make America what it is today.
Senator Crane, someone put as a question in the chat that they saw on your tagline, courage where it counts.
Yeah,
courage. A question for both candidates, beginning with Senator Crane. Please give examples of your legislative courage.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we had that tagline and we've used it because one of the things that really frustrated me prior to getting into the legislature is that you hear candidates and politicians say, oh, I'm going to stand for this and I'm going to stand against that, and then end up folding like a cheap suit. And so I think it's important to make sure that, if we have principles that we are guiding our lives and our leadership, that they can be swayed with enough pressure, then those aren't principles. And in my own case, I can think of one particular example that really, I think, solidified this. back in 17. And I share this not to throw my colleagues under the bus, but there was a budget issue. It was a budget year. And I had some folks from the Avon School District here in Hendricks County that had reached out to me to say, hey, we need you to vote against the budget, which is a monumental request. And the reason why was trying to get some more funding for the Avon school system. And so I said, yeah, I'll do it. At that time, I naively thought, well, surely there'll be another Republican that'll vote against the budget because there's a number of things that you could have a problem with a, at that time, $32 billion budget. And come to find out, when the board was up and people were voting, I ended up being the only Republican to join all the Democrats to vote against the budget, to the point where the then Senate Pro Tem, who's since retired, came and chewed me out on the floor in front of my colleagues and asked what was going on. I tried to give him a quick answer, explaining that I had some constituents that asked me to vote that way. And he said to me, we'll talk about this later. And we did. And it ended up being a very good conversation, allowed me to give him some perspective from where I was coming from. But that stands out in my mind as one of many times where you have to put principles before party sometimes in order to do the right thing. And that, I think, is very much in keeping with that idea of demonstrating courage when it counts.
Thank you. Mr. Albaugh, your response, an example of courage where it counts.
I would say that I have displayed that most of or all of my adult life in the service of this country. Numerous situations that I could cite. What I would like to do, though, is bring up that it's not very courageous when you're endorsing legislation that works against LGBTQ families, or legislating morality, or advocating the legislation of morality, or even stating it's not a question of legislating morality, it's simply whose morality are you going to legislate. Those types of things are easy to do when you're referring to that as courage, when it is just pushing your own agenda. I would argue that that is not courage, that is absolutely just pushing your agenda. I personally would tell you that I'm a strong believer in term limits. Yes, my party doesn't like the idea that I signed the pledge for term limits. I am going to the state legislature. I want to fix the public education funding debacle that we have based on that constitutional amendment in the back door that the legislature put in with all these referendums. And if I can't fix it before the one in Avon renews by 2026, then I'm the wrong guy. I won't run again. Those types of things, I don't believe that legislators should do this forever. It should not be a career. People should come in and participate in the process and then move on, and not permanently become career politicians.
Thank you. Mr. Albaugh, right now in Indiana, Indiana has no private owner legislative training required to receive a gun license. Would you support changes in this area?
Absolutely. I appreciate that question. As I said, I'm a gun owner. I have a concealed carry permit. My wife is a gun owner. I've spent 30 years in the military. I very much support that. And I support the legislation. I support law enforcement, but I also support responsible gun owner legislation. The idea that I was working as a real estate broker, to give you an example, and every time somebody gets attacked, because a woman feels threatened, she goes and she buys a gun. She puts it in her purse and she doesn't know how to use it. And she comes and talks to me and asks me questions on how to operate this gun. And so she's carrying a loaded weapon in her purse and never fired it and never proficient. I think that people should have to demonstrate proficiency. I think they should have to register and license. That way law enforcement can determine how those guns and be able to track them. And when they turn up in criminals' hands, they can figure out why and how they got there. I think it's a simple safety issue. They should have to take a written test and know what the state law is so that they can be in compliance. They should absolutely have to take an operator's test and be able to demonstrate proficiency with that weapon so that they can, if something happens, they're actually able to hit what they're shooting at, versus kill somebody in the house next door because they're unable. All of that is still supports responsible gun ownership to keep the guns out of the hands of criminals and to make sure that those citizens that have them know how to operate them. We do it for cars, why can't we do it for guns?
Thank you. Senator Crane, what are your thoughts on requiring training to receive a gun license?
Thank you. This does go back to the earlier conversation we had about gun ownership and the Second Amendment and so forth. And as I stated then, the implied assumption is that gun ownership corresponds with responsible gun ownership. And with that responsibility comes exactly the idea of education and operation of that firearm. So I would be very open to making sure that those who are asking for a license have the corresponding responsibility associated with stewarding that license.
Thank you. Next audience questions. What have you learned about the challenges faced by our LGBTQ residents and how are you going to support them? Senator Crane?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really important question because it's one of the biggest cultural conversations going on right now. I have friends and family members who are part of the LGBTQ community, and I think that they, like any of us, are human beings that are wanting to be loved and wanting to make a go of it, wanting to have opportunity and wanting respect and dignity and all those things that I think all human beings should have. And so I attempt to try to have positive relationships with folks, whoever they are, whether they're part of the LGBT community or part of another party or part of somebody who, even in my own wing of our party, who disagrees with me. I think going back to a previous question that we had, one of the important things that we need to do first and foremost is to listen and to learn. And that goes back to the diversity question. It's very easy to kind of poach and pot shot from a distance if we haven't had interaction with other people who may see things from a different light. And so wherever possible, I try to be proactive in building those relationships. I've been very proactive, as he verified himself, with my Senate colleague who's openly gay. And I think we still have a good relationship based on some of the feedback that I saw on Facebook. He may not like me anymore, I don't know, because of a position I have on my website. But I reached out to him with a personal note and asked to follow up with him and clarify my position and make sure that our relationship is positive. I haven't heard anything back yet, and I'm waiting to hear back, but it comes from a heart on my side of genuinely trying to understand. I think, and just briefly, I go back to a comment I made earlier. I think it's very easy for us to kind of get siloed into our own belief system and surrounded with people who just look at the world the same way we do, and then treat everybody else like the enemy, regardless of who they are or where they're coming from. And so I would love to see on all sides, all of us first and foremost to follow the golden rule of treating people the way we want to be treated. And I think in doing so, we'll all be better off for it.
Thank you. Mr. Albaugh, what have you learned about the challenges faced by our LGBTQ residents and how are you going to support them?
I have actually learned a lot, very supportive, I spent my life defending the Constitution. That Constitution affords people the rights and liberties for them to choose who they love and how they live. And I've absolutely believed that my entire life. I would argue that we have some problems here in Indiana that we need to work on. And one of those has to do with, for an example, our inability to pass sufficient comprehensive hate crime legislation. Because the legislature seems to believe that by identifying something that's a hate crime towards an LGBTQ member somehow lessens the impact on a crime that the judge has the ability to upgrade to a hate crime towards another individual. But as a result, we're still on the list of one of the 5 states that are unable to do that. I have personally heard my opponent speak against that at some legislative breakfasts, much to my disappointment. I am glad to hear his comments about his outreach and the efforts that he has put forth trying to help bring the community and stuff together. I think we need to do more of that across the board. I don't think that we have enough protections for that community, both in education, healthcare, certainly job rights. I mean, we're certainly saying that somebody can say, for whatever, if they want to, they can say that their religious belief certainly trumps somebody else's belief for them to live their life the way they think is necessary. I have always been a proponent that your rights extend to the end of my nose. And so how you live your life, those are your decisions for you to be able to determine and manage and to make those decisions until they impede upon my rights. Well, when you're able to fire somebody because of the way that they live their life, now you are projecting or forcing your religious beliefs onto somebody else, because if you have that belief, you're unable to work here, or you're unable, don't need to make you a wedding cake, or I'm not going to provide you service, or that type of legislation. I think that is very harmful, and I think we need to do everything that we can to protect against that, and it would certainly start with comprehensive hate crime legislation.
Thank you. This concludes the audience question portion of our forum. We have many more questions in the chat, but we're going to allow you to ask those in the small group sessions because we are out of time for this section. I do want to take a moment to remind everyone to please make your voice heard by voting in the upcoming election. I also want to thank all of our participants this evening. Thank you to our two candidates, Mr. Stan Albaugh and Senator John Crane, for joining us tonight. I also want to thank the panelists and our moderator for the evening. And thank you to the Banner Graphic, the League of Women Voters, and WGRE, who will now resume their regular programming.